Okay, good morning, everyone. We'll make a relatively slow start and introduce ourselves as we begin the session. So I know people will be joining us over the next few minutes. So, first of all, just to say that my name is Paul Whitty. I'm a professor of music and sound. I'm based in the School of Arts, where I'm head of school, Oxford Brookes University, and I'm a member of the steering group of the Creative Industries Research and Innovation Network. And I'm really pleased to have been asked to host this session today, looking at the role of unions in the creative industries in particular. So, as mentioned, the panel brings together voices from two of our major unions. We have Charlotte Bence from Equity and Nat Witts-Kilshaw from the Musicians Union. And they're going to be talking a bit about the kind of realities of creative labour today, looking perhaps we'll talk about pay equity, we might talk about working conditions and their experiences of representing artists and those involved in the creative industries. So I thought the first thing I would do was invite Nat and Charlotte to introduce themselves, perhaps say something about the union they work for and something about their role within that. So Nat, is it okay to start with you?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Morning, everybody. So I'm Nat at work at the Musicians Union. I'm the live theatre and music writers official. So I look after, along with my team, those three areas across. So theatre, pretty self-explanatory. Live is anything that's going to be happening on a stage other than theatre, and then writing. So we're talking about commission, where musicians are being commissioned to write music, for example, and songwriters, and it includes everybody in that. So the Musicians Union represents over 37,000 members in the UK. We're the only union for musicians in the UK. We represent anybody working in their capacity as a musician. So that, as always, is a portfolio career with musicians for the most part. So you might be teaching, you might be doing a bit of session work, you might be doing some touring, you might be doing theatre, you might be doing some writing, you might be doing all of those things all at the same time. So our job is to represent you as much as we can in that workplace. So we have there's an enormous amount of work that we do for all of those sectors. So yeah, I won't go into them now. I'm sure they'll come up during the hour today. But I was a musician for 15 years before I joined the MU as well. So just a little background, which can be helpful. So I have a lived experience of being a musician, as most of our union officials do. Actually, at the Musicians Union, we've often come from playing straight into the union. So that's a kind of, it means that we're able to sort of have that real life experience and be able to pay it forward and make sure that we're protecting the musicians coming after us.
Great, thanks very much, Nat. Charlotte, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. My name's Charlotte Bence. I am Equity's theatre official, which means I am responsible for many of the collective agreements that we have with different management associations in theatre. So Equity represents performers, not musicians, stage managers, directors, designers, and other members of the creative team, such as choreographers. And a key part of our role is to negotiate minimum terms and conditions of employment or engagement for the workers that we represent in theatre. We do that by negotiating what are called collective agreements with organisations such as SALT, which is the Society of London Theatre, or UK Theatre, which is the management association that represents commercial and subsidised theatre producers and venues all around the UK. We also do a lot of work advising our members and supporting members who are working on contracts that are not underpinned by the union's minimum terms agreements, such as in fringe theatre or immersive theatre, student film, non-union TV production, all that sort of stuff. We do a lot of work on sort of trying to improve those collective agreements, sort of constantly trying to drive up those minimum terms that the people we represent can expect as a floor, not a ceiling, when they're working in theatre around the UK. And we're also very active on a political front in terms of lobbying and campaigning around issues such as arts funding or improvements to the rights that people have when they're at work, whether they are genuinely self-employed or whether they are employees or workers. So the whole purpose of trade unions is the promotion, protection and extension of people's rights at work. And we do that across a variety of different forms. We represent around 50,000 workers within the creative industries, across all the sort of different disciplines that I mentioned earlier, across theatre and recorded media and what we call variety, which is your drag artists, comedians, burlesque performers and so on. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Charlotte. So just to say what we're going to do, we're going to run through a kind of series of topics and discussion themes in the session. If you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the chat. We'll give at least 10 minutes or 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the session for questions that come through from the floor. So I guess we'll just kick off with our themes and work through them. So the first one, Nat and Charlotte, was I'd be really interested to hear from both of you in terms of what you consider to be the most pressing issues facing the workforce in the creative industries, particularly for those at the beginning of their careers. So I wonder if, Nat, I can come to you on that one.
Yeah, on your career, you can be quite susceptible to unfair practices. So often, especially with musicians and as the creative people is what I kind of mean when I say musicians. There's that kind of risk of exploitation when you first start out, because you want to get to your goal and you want to get there as soon as you can, and you think that if I take this opportunity where I might be paying to play, for example, in a grassroots venue, or that can take on many guises, or if I do that might kind of get me to the next stage. And I think that real risk of exploitation early doors is a risk that's one of the, I would say, is one of the major risks for when you're first starting out early on your career. One of the things that Equity and Musicians Union do is to try to educate those people coming from the grassroots side of things, in whatever industry you're working in, the creative arts, to make sure that you understand what is fair practice and what should and shouldn't be asked of you during an engagement, to whether that's playing or whether that's commissioning. We do such a wide range of things. I'm trying not to forget anything. But say, for instance, you're working in the live, you're looking to be your own solo artist or a band, or we've got our Fair Play Guide, which kind of helps educate people, emerging artists coming out, to go, okay, what's fair? What should a promoter be asking of me, and what shouldn't they be asking of me? Should they be asking for me to promote the show when they are the promoter and doing lots of extra legwork which is unpaid? Sometimes maybe yes, because there could be a different part of that deal which kind of is more understandable. But we kind of look at all the ways that you may be engaged early on in your career. But as echoing everything Charlotte just said at the beginning, we have our collective bargaining agreements, so that we have an absolute minimum standards of what you should be and how you should be engaged. We have our live rate, we have all our promulgated rates, which means they are like our collective bargaining agreement. That means that they aren't set, agreed with anybody party in particular, but they are minimum rates, which most, for example, most funding organisations, Arts Council, etc., will expect our rates to be met for musicians. So there's lots of kind of educational work that we do around that to try and really protect musicians coming out and going, right, okay, so what's the best way? How should I be engaged? And to spot those kind of moments when they're going, hang on a minute, I feel like I'm being taken advantage of here, and that doesn't feel right. And so what we try to do is make sure that we're the people that go, this doesn't feel right, is that right? And then we can kind of educate those members. In terms of the pressing, that's the kind of, that risk of exploitation is there always throughout your career, to be honest. I don't think that ever really goes. You just become a little bit more aware of what you're willing to accept and what you're not willing to accept, and you start putting your boundaries in once you've had a couple of experiences where you're thinking, I won't want to do that again. We have external issues which we can't control. Post-Brexit touring has become incredibly challenging for our members. We have a risk of the rise in AI. Obviously, that is incredibly worrisome for our members as well. We're doing a lot of work on streaming, trying to make sure that especially musicians that are playing on those tracks are able to be remunerated. So there isn't one. There's lots of kind of different pressures. Some of those things we can control, and some of them we can't. And it's how we're trying to, it's how we react to them as a union to try to do our best to protect our members, really.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Nat. I mean, it's very interesting because I guess artists are particularly vulnerable at the beginning of their careers. And also probably may well not have had very much guidance about how to navigate, those difficult kind of contract negotiations, and also, they will be, as you say, they'll be very keen to to get their work out there, and that can have negative consequences at times. Thanks. Charlotte, how about in your area in equity? Yeah.
Identical. I mean, both Equity and the Musicians Union websites have a whole range of resources available for people to sort of understand what minimum standards for their particular profession should look like, and routes that we can help you with where those minimum standards aren't met or where you might have questions. And I think that is particularly important, because if you don't know what your rights are, it is easier for a bad employer to take them away from you. So we are very keen to, raise awareness that though that information is out there, both unions and indeed BEC2, another union in the entertainment industry, have comprehensive advice and guidance available for people. In addition to what Nat's already talked about around the sort of lingering problems around Brexit, I think it's worth being really clear about the huge impact that has had on the employment landscape for creative workers of all stripes, because now that freedom of movement and that ability to work and live and travel easily all around the EU has been lost, we have seen a sharp decline in the number of work opportunities for our people from all creative worker disciplines, because it is now so much harder for venues, producers, operators who are based in an EU state to engage somebody who is a UK national or a British national, I should say. Now, that's had an impact on jobs. The thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is the funding landscape in the sector. We have seen a huge decline over the past sort of 20 years of the amount of money that is sent to arts and culture organisations, whether that's through national funding organisations like Arts Council England, Arts Council Wales, Creative Scotland, but also through local authority funding. So time was, not only would organisations receive pots of money from the Arts Council to develop and sustain their activities, but they would also be in receipt of significant sums of money from the local authority. When local authority budgets have been squeezed to the extent they have, and obviously in recent years we've seen numbers of local authorities across England declaring themselves bankrupt because the financial situation is so dire, the funding for arts and culture has been cut as well. And that has had an impact on the number of jobs that the subsidised sector is able to sustain. And I think those two sort of pressure points of Brexit and funding have combined to create a much worsened landscape for people who are emerging into the sector, as well as those who have been working in the sector for a long time and remember when there were more jobs around than there are now. The third element that I talk about in terms of that combination of external factors that Nat refers to is the pandemic, because we are some way away from lockdown and various other things, but particularly in theatre, the levels of production and activity that we saw pre-pandemic, we're not quite there yet. We're not quite at the levels of pre-pandemic activity and therefore jobs when it comes to things like commercial touring, like subsidised theatre. So those three things in combination are resulting in a much tougher employment landscape for creative workers of all disciplines, which of course has a corresponding impact on the point that Nat made at the start. Because when you emerge into the sector, when you don't necessarily know what your rights are, and you're keen to build your career and get yourself out there, the exploitation you might experience at the start of your career is exacerbated by the fact that in a labour market that was already extremely competitive, has become more so because of factors outside of the sector. So it is a very different industry now that people are emerging into compared to the one that they were emerging into previously. And the final thing that I'd add on that is the punitive welfare state that we have now. Many of our older members, people of my age and up, will talk about how possible it was to sustain yourself on various forms of social security whilst you were making your art, whatever expression that art took, right? You know, you could claim a amount of social security that was livable. The universal credit system being as punitive as it is means that is no longer possible. So there's a whole load of social, political, industrial pressures that have combined to sort of enhance that exploitation that people can experience, which is why it becomes all the more important that people do know what their rights are and are prepared to stand up for them. Because the more that we sort of normalize those cultures of exploitation that can exist within certain pockets of the sector, the harder and harder the maintenance of a viable, sustainable and successful career becomes.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, I mean, what you're describing there is a very kind of complex, precarious, difficult context, really, in which artists are entering and others, you know, who are wanting to work in the creative industries. So I suppose my next question is really, in that context, in that difficult context we've discussed, how can creativity be nourished so that their work, the artifacts, the content created by our creative industries retain value and impact on the wider community beyond commercial interests? Because I suppose what you're describing there is a reduction in local authority funding, a reduction in funding from arts councils and arts bodies. And so what comes into that void, if it is a void, is more commercial interests. So I don't know whether I wonder if you could give us an update on that, Nat, what you think about how we can, within that context, continue to nourish kind of creative, difficult, innovative work.
Yeah, it's a hard question, really, isn't it? I mean, it's a difficult one to answer, I should say. It's how we can. I mean, what the arts is, it's an incredible sector, you know, and we will survive, and we are surviving, and it's how we adapt to these pressures, that the external pressures that are being put on us. You know, one of the things, the sort of thing that Charlotte was talking about, and it's kind of reminded me of, we have all these external pressures, you know, funding, Brexit, you know, everything we've been talking about, all these external pressures that are happening to us, and we have little control really over how that affects us as musicians. But we have to be real that it does affect the work that comes out, the creative work that is able to be funded. You know, it does really exacerbate the class divide within the creative world of, you know, that kind of age-old, you know, bank of mum and dad, is that horrible phrase, but, you know, really, like, if you're going to be an up-and-coming artist now, or working or trying to write a new theatre show, or you know, you need to have money behind you, because realistically the funding isn't there. Well, it's not realistically, it is not, it's much harder to get to, whereas you used to be able to sort of, you know, you might do one or two submissions to a funding application. Now it's, you know, you're putting yourself up against so many other people now. It's becomes really, really difficult you have to sort of become fluent in funding applications to be able to, you know, receive your funding, which is a massive barrier. I think, you know, I'm sorry, I realise I'm just sort of going off topic slightly, but I suppose how we protect it is us. You know, it's the work that we do as unions, that we that's our job, is to try to make, you know, we want our members ultimately to be doing their work and doing what they've been training to do, you know, or like, yeah, however that is, whether that's formally or informally. I think, unfortunately, we live in a world where, you know, commercial success is what is seen as the end point. But that, as I said, the systems that we have in place at the moment and the precariousness we have make that quite difficult for musicians. So I guess it's for us, we make sure as unions that we are nourishing the business side for them, you know, to make sure that, like as Charlotte was saying, making sure that we have our collective bargaining agreements, and making sure that we are always punching up, you know, we're always making sure they're getting better, having those minimum terms and conditions, so that we can then advise the members on how, you know, negotiating is really hard, all those things, you know, so we can be there then to help them with that, so that then they can then create the work. I mean, how, you know, the other thing is that with the world that it is at the moment, the art that is coming out is, there's some fantastic things coming out in response to everything that's happening, and whether that's, when I say everything, I'm not trying to be too glib, but I'm talking about there's so many things that are happening in the world which will have an effect on the musicians. So it's a hard one to answer. It'll be interesting to see what you have to say, Charlotte. But yeah, how somebody continues to nourish their work. I suppose it depends on the expanded term of which they're feeling. But yeah, wonder what you think, Charlotte.
Yeah, Charlotte, over to you.
And I think it's not all doom and gloom. Like, there's a lot that's grim and there's a lot that's really hard, but good work is happening in communities all around the UK all the time. It's just that people now have to be a bit more creative about where and how that good work can happen. And I'm not talking about the vaguely patronising message that sometimes comes out to younger creative workers, like, oh, if you can't get hired, just make your own work. Because, as Nat says, all that does is exacerbate class inequalities within the system. Because, okay, you're making your own work, but who's paying for the rehearsal venue? Who's hiring the theatre in which you're going to perform that work? Where's all the cash for that coming from? But there are really good small-scale companies doing important work in environments like supporting people who have been through the criminal justice system, using arts and culture to do that kind of work. There is good work happening in community organisations doing stuff with people in hospitals or with particular conditions. There is good work happening in all sorts of different contexts, and they are hiring creative workers and they are making work. Like, that sort of route that people may have been accustomed to of, I have finished my drama school or my training or whatever form of, whatever path I've taken to develop the skill I have, and now I am looking for a traditional creative industries job. They don't exist in the same number, but that more sort of hyper-local community work is still happening and is still there and is still a route to a viable career in the creative industries that can and will fast track people to other parts of the sector that they might want to work in. Like, the work is out there. It's just that I think people have to be a bit more imaginative about what that work might look like now than perhaps they once did. But this has always been a really, really competitive industry to work in, because so many people want to be a musician, want to be an actor, want to be a theatre director, want to be a choreographer. People have always had to use their creativity to approach that job hunt creatively as well, right? That is still true, but it is still possible. And there are pots of money available. Arts Council grants do still exist. Local authorities, not all of them, but many of them will still give out money to local organisations that can deliver a tangible, meaningful, output for the community that they're located in. It's just that you do have to develop that additional skill set of not just being really good at what you do, but thinking about how you communicate that fully and effectively in order to maximise your chance of getting the cash off the organisations that do exist to fund it, or thinking about what organisations are already out there doing the kind of work that you want to do and how you can get yourself involved in them in a paid capacity.
Part of that is us, right? That role is us. We've got a UK artist touring fund that we're launching with Featured Artists Coalition coming out soon to be applied for. So it's, as Charlotte was saying, it isn't all doom and gloom. The pots of money, new pots of money are being created outside of the big funding bodies like Arts Council, Creative Scotland, Arts Council Wales. Smaller pots are being created by other smaller organisations, which, as Charlotte was saying, is a kind of race to the top. So there are new bits of the funding. I think it's just, as Charlotte was saying, it's just changing. When I left music college, I started on the classical course, which my idea was I would come out and I would take a chair in an orchestra. But there's 20 major orchestras in the UK. I was very unlikely, of all the people coming out of college at the same time, to be one of those trombone players. So you have to then start thinking, well, how's that? Even exacerbated more if you're a violinist, for example. You want to be the lead or the section leader. There's one of those jobs, within an orchestra. So you have to start thinking, well, how do I make that career? that can be my goal, but I may need to do a bit of a zigzag in order to get there. And I think like that when I was talking about earlier the portfolio career, and it's similar for equities members as well. It's not just that, okay, that may be your dream, but there are other ways in order to get there. And it also might mean that it takes you off a different way. I always thought I had one way I was going to go, and then suddenly I went into another part of the industry just by chance because I said yes to a gig. And you're doing lots of different things within the creative community. And I think one of the most important things as a creative is that you can get nourished by creatism, not just in the path that you're choosing to follow. I got a lot of, from teaching, for example, that really, really boosted my creativity in terms of writing, for example, because you're sort of having that challenge of writing for somebody that's not going to maybe read the music as easily as some of your, peers in music college, for example. So there's lots of different ways that you can kind of positively boost that while you're trying to find that route for yourself in the industry. But I agree with Charlotte, it's completely changed, but it's not all for the worse. There's lots of places that are making it more, the parity is coming through, and we're doing a lot of work to try and make sure that it's equal opportunities to everybody coming out, really.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think just building on that. So obviously with your experiences of working with younger artists who are early in their career in your union roles, how do you think academic institutions can best support artists coming out of college? Because it's interesting to hear you say, Nat, about, sounds like you were a trombonist and you had an aim to kind of join an orchestra, have a chair in an orchestra. How do you, but you went on a different route. So how can HE institutions support their students better in a way to kind of think about the range of possibilities that might be open to them, or developing different forms of resilience? I don't know, I'd just be interested to see if you've got any reflections on that from your experiences or experiences working with younger artists.
Yeah, I think in my experience, I went to Trinity Laban as it is now. So I did a couple of terms on the classical course and then swapped to the jazz course. But as a trombone player, as you said, I think my main takeaways, my personal kind of takeaway from studying at an institution, was that they didn't prepare me was going to come. I think there are some benefits to it. What they do is train you to become, the idea at the time, this was a long time ago, I graduated sort of 15, 20 years ago. Things have changed slightly. I think they've broadened for some of the organisations, some of the institutions anyway, but there was no true kind of reflection of what actually might happen to me once I graduated and got my hat and tipped it up into the air and gone, yay, I'm a professional trombonist, come and get me orchestras or come and get me film studio. There was no this is what actually happens in real life. The idea was that you were being trained to do that. And I think there's two outcomes to that. One, it really puts people up into this, if you don't get it, you failed, which is categorically, in my opinion, untrue. And if if the job isn't there, then you've been somehow failed by the institution as well. To some extent, maybe that is true. But I think what I would love to see, this is something I've worked on. In fact, I did a little bit of a project with Black Lives in Music actually not so long ago, and in a previous role here at the MU, is to try and be actually realistic about what would happen. I remember my professor, head of my department, I was doing a function and I had to, someone's wedding or something, and I had to go off one of the rehearsals a little bit early, and he wouldn't let me because he said that the gig I was doing wasn't in the jazz kind of field. It was too commercial, and that I should be working in a bookshop for free, but trying to increase my creativity, and that should be my role. But unfortunately, I have to pay bills and I have to pay the rent, and those commercial kind of functions were the place that I did that. And actually, I cut my teeth doing loads of, you'd be learning tunes on the job, you're listening to somebody next to you, there's so many skills that can be learned. And I think what I would implore institutions to do is to be able to go, you may want this, but you also have to open your minds to many other things that you might be doing if you're playing an instrument, what you could do with that instrument. So for me, I was going to do classical, then I started jazz. I absolutely knew from quite early on I was not going to be a jazz trombonist. I wasn't going to be releasing albums under my name. I wasn't going to have a quartet. I knew that wasn't where I would be able to fit in that space. I was doing a lot of commercial stuff. I happened to take on White Christmas on a theatre show. I just said yes because it was a gig, and it was like going to be a little bit of, continuous money for 5 or 6 weeks. And then I never stopped working in theatre after that. And that never, ever occurred to me. The option of going into theatre hadn't even been, it was never spoken about. It was almost at that point seen as a bit of theatre. That's where people, if you haven't got into orchestras, might go. Now it's seen post-pandemic, seen as, I'm sure Charlotte it'll be slightly different for Charlotte's members, but post-pandemic it's the pinnacle, it's where you kind of want to be, because we have an excellent collective bargaining agreement, if I don't say so myself, in equity. We've got those minimum terms, well looked after, it's regular work, and then you have all this time in the day to be able to explore revenue. So it's like, I think it's really making sure there's not enough kind of business knowledge of teaching, in my experience, certainly not of what happens, how do you settle an invoice, these things like that. They're kind of these young adults are just left to kind of navigate for themselves, and they may never have even had to send an invoice before, and suddenly they're being asked to do it. It's those small things, but that's how you get paid, and that's how you pay your rent. So I do feel quite strongly about the lack of kind of real life teachings that is happening within the kind of concerns. But I can only speak for that because that's the system that I came through. But I know it'll be slightly different for equity members.
Thanks Nat.
Quite intense courses.
Thanks Nat. What are your thoughts on that, Charlotte, in terms of what HE institutions can do better?
Well, I'm gonna pick you up on your use of the word resilience, actually, because I think we have to be quite careful when we talk about the need to be resilient, because I agree with you that there's a need for a level of resilience when dealing with the knockbacks that people entering this industry will get, right? The thing that a lot of our members talk about quite frequently is that you're not going to get every job that you go for. You're just not. And of course, nobody in the economy, in any sector of the British economy, gets every job that they apply for. But that experience of applying for roles and receiving that rejection, because of the short-term nature of work in these industries, is a much more common experience for creative industry workers than it is for people who are, employed on a long-term permanent contract, for example. So there's a need to build up a certain level of resilience and understand that you will not get everything that you apply for a whole variety of reasons, and some of which are wholly arbitrary and outside of your control. Particularly when you're talking about people who appear on a stage. The reality for a number of our members, be that in TV or film, is that part of the criteria for whether or not they might get a particular job or not is going to be about how they look. And there will only be certain things that people can do to change that in ways that are healthy. So when we talk about resilience, we have to be very careful to separate out the kind of resilience that will be required in a structural sense from the resilience that we need to move away from, which is a sort of slightly tired message that comes out of some of the older drama schools about resilience meaning that you just have to put up with things that are bad, and that you shouldn't complain when your rights are taken away from you, or that you are lucky to have a job because you are in this really competitive industry and oh my God, isn't it so exciting? So I would urge a note of caution around the use of that word in particular, and absolute clarity on what forms of resilience we're talking about and where resilience is not appropriate. Because it is not appropriate to build a resilience that means that you're expected to just sort of take every bit of nonsense from a bad engager. And I think universities and drama schools can be doing a lot more to not only, as Nat says, sort of open people's eyes to the different possibilities for their careers and the reality of what that post-graduation experience of looking for work might be, but also to help them better understand what their rights are. Because we talked about this at the start, but it really is absolutely central to everything. That sort of initial emergence into the sector where you're really keen to establish yourself, you're really keen to understand what's what, you're less likely to be in a union yet because you won't necessarily have joined. That is a really vulnerable moment for people. And if they have a particularly poor experience, it can entirely put them off the career that they've spent the past 3 years training for and got into goodness knows how much of debt because of what's happening, what's happened with the universities and the costs for tuition now. So I think there's more that needs to be done at sort of graduating student level around understanding what forms of resilience are appropriate and supporting students to understand what their rights are and how they can get support in enforcing or protecting those rights.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks, Charlotte. That's fascinating. Thanks. I might just come straight back to you then on the next question, which is, how can unions support their members engage with the creative industries to help create a sustainable and inclusive creative economy, which is something you've sort of touched on, I think, there.
Yeah, I mean, look, the industry is not sustainable when it is underpinned by poor terms and conditions. And I think one of the things that winds me up the most about some sectors of the industry, you get a lot of this in the subsidised sector, where you get chat about how, arts and culture changes lives and it's so transformative. And that's true. But when that transformation for the communities that those organisations work with is predicated on poor pay and bad terms and conditions for the creative workers who are doing the transformational work, then that is not sustainable. You cannot make your best work if you are worrying about how you're going to pay your rent. You cannot commit yourself entirely and with your full enthusiasm and skill to the transformative work that you're trying to do and be part of if you are being bullied by the producer, another company member, anybody else. So I think when we talk about a sustainable and inclusive industry, it is one that is underpinned by decent and reasonable terms and conditions of employment. And that is why a big part of the work that both Equity and the Musicians Union do is not just defending the collectively bargained agreements that we've got already, but trying to get more of them established to cover more and more areas of the sector, because good art means good terms and conditions. And I think the fundamental message is that creativity cannot be at the cost of the creative workers. But there are too many examples of where that is the case. There are too many examples of people who have been entirely burnt out from careers in the sector because they have not experienced the kind of sustainability or inclusivity in the environment that they're working in that good art and sustainable careers are predicated upon, which is why we, organisations like ours continue to do what we do, because we want a sector in which people receive a fair day's pay for a fair day's work and can flourish in their chosen profession. That won't be possible if they're not paid or they're having a bad time.
That's great. Thanks, Charlotte. Nat, what would your thoughts be on that?
Yeah, I think, kind of echoing what Charlotte's just said, I think in the arts we romanticize suffering. It's for the arts. You must suffer. It's hard work, and it's that. I think our job is to go. No, you've trained very, very hard to when that creative is to the point where they are, and that our job is to make sure that the scaffolding is there for you to be able to do whatever you need to do within that organisation. So exactly what Charlotte was saying, as Equity have agreements with UK Theatre and SALT, as do we. We have our collective bargaining agreements with BPI, which look after all the record labels. We do lots of work with PRS and PPL, so that make sure that the royalties get. And the part of it is that is our role, is to make sure that we are enforcing fair work and pay, making sure that we're enforcing safety and good within our musicians for our members as well. Influencing policy, with government, that is part of our role as well as a union, as the what we're afforded as unions, and also doing cross work, working with Equity, working with Bectu, working with other organisations as well that represent. So Music Managers Forum, for example, Featured Artists Coalition, our job is to make sure that we are bringing everybody with us and going, well, this is the absolute minimum we think you should be engaged, and it's a punch up. And I think without unions, we would be in a little bit of the Wild West, where it would be a case of what's the bare minimum somebody's willing to accept. But yeah, I think it's as a musician myself and joining it, if you're an emerging artist or you're coming out, as Charlotte was saying, I can't say this is the time to join the union, because this is the time that you'll need to be, you can use us to your advantage while you're going up into that, while you're going to travel through whatever route you're going to try to get to, get to what you define as your success. But yeah.
Thanks, Nat. We've just got a questions coming on the comments from James Cateridge, which is, are Equity or the MU involved in mentoring schemes for young creative workers, or are there informal support structures which can pass knowledge down the generations? So I don't know, Nat, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we do lots of work with. We don't offer anything internal in house as such, but we work with organisations. So we work with, I think, the Women Music Leaders Network. We have some mentoring schemes that we kind of subsidise places for. But if you are a member of the union, you are absolutely. Our phone lines are always open. We're very contactable via email, via phone. And often I used to be a London regional officer, which meant I was as part of the team would look after the London members. And quite often we would have career advice sessions with those members. And it would be kind of like it would be, if somebody called up and said, I really want to work in theatre, then most likely they would be speaking to me. If there was other parts, orchestras, they might speak to somebody else. So yeah, you can set up, in terms of informal career and mentoring, whilst we don't offer kind of ongoing mentoring, we're absolutely always here to have a one-to-one chat about the particulars of your situation, where you're trying to get to and how you might get there. Because often it kind of, in my experience of it anyway, it often sparked a few of, I didn't think I could do that. Yeah, that's a good idea. Maybe that is a way of like subsidising this part of my life. And if I did this, then I can do that. And then maybe it'll give me somewhere else. So I think and also, I always underpinning that what we would be going through your situation of what is fair and what isn't fair, what you should. But yeah, so what the best thing to do, we offer quite a lot in that, and also across all of the different parts of the sector that we represent, is just to have a little look on our website, and you can have little drop downs for all the sections that we have. But yeah, there's lots of mentoring stuff out there, certainly, which is it's really exciting actually to see, because it wasn't kind of really around when I left.
Great, that sounds brilliant, Nat. How about you, Charlotte, with Equity?
We don't have any formal mentoring schemes, because I think trade unions are not really the best organisations to do that. Our role is what Nat's just outlined, that sort of individual advice on particular situations and that sort of stuff. What we do have is a network of branches all around the UK, which are run by Equity members themselves, and they are monthly or sometimes every 2-month meetings of the Equity members in a particular local area. Usually hybrid, so people will turn up in person and online, and they are really, really good places to meet fellow working professionals, and particularly when you are emerging into the sector, the kind of networks that you can make through the union, as a way to sort of be in touch with other people who might be a bit further along in their careers than you are, and can offer you that sort of advice and support that you might be looking for in a mentoring relationship. Those branches are really good places to find that. We also have a series of different networks within the union, which is slightly less formal sort of groupings of members around a particular issue. So there is, for example, a Green New Deal network, which is a network that was set up by a group of Equity members, particularly interested in thinking about how the theatre industry and TV and film industry should respond to the climate emergency. There's also various networks for different professions, like there's an actor musicians network, there's a wrestlers network, there's all sorts of stuff going on. So much like that, have a look on the website if Equity would be the right union for what you're training for. Look at our student membership structures, look at the stuff that exists on the getting involved section. There are all kinds of different ways into being not just a member of the union, but being active within it and getting the support from the union in a whole variety of different forms, as well as the individual benefits that you get when you join.
Brilliant. Thanks, Charlotte. This may be our last question. We'll see. But I just was going to ask, perhaps you could give us any examples in your areas of excellent practice where the union has led to a change in working conditions or a new approach to an issue. Nat, is there anything within the MU?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. It's the instinct was to go for all the big stuff, the stuff that we see in the news, where where we get kind of success. So whether that's as I was talking about earlier, our UCAT touring fund, which is about to be launched, or big streaming campaign, for example, where we've had quite a few videos that have recently gone viral about that, about making sure that our session musicians are getting remunerated. At the moment, it's only the featured artists that get royalties, PPL. So we are trying to make sure that the session musicians are also for streaming. Sorry, I'm talking about the session musicians are also remunerated. So we do that quite big stuff like that, where we're in the Guardian or wherever, we're in the news. But actually, I think in terms of working at a union and only leaving playing to work at the musicians union, some of the best stuff that we've done is the everyday stuff that we do. So you might have a member that calls up and says, could you just have a look at this commissioning contract? I think it's fine, is the classic line. I just want to could you give it a once over? And then suddenly you look and you realise it's a buyout, or it's the fee isn't representative of perhaps what's being asked of them. And suddenly you point out these things, and it's a moment for them to be like, I didn't even realise that. And if I hadn't have come to you, I would have lost any kind of future control over this art that I've just signed over to somebody, or they have a legal advice and assistance. So that's a big part of what we do. Our regions do is unpaid fees, seeking unpaid fees, seeking cancellation fees. We get back millions a year for members for our services doing that. So I think for me, it's those little. They're huge wins for the members. They don't make national newspaper headlines, but they're huge wins for the members. You can get somebody back £100, and that's a difference in paying their bills that month or not. And I think that is one of the amazing things as a union that we do, both of us do, as unions, is to be able to support the members when it goes wrong, as well as and to support them when it goes right as well. But in terms of theatre, for example, I have many stories in my life of you have somebody that's supposed to be following a collective agreement, for example, and then you get a contract and they're not following the collective agreement, and the difference it may not be a monetary difference, but the terms and conditions the underlying terms and conditions may not attract, as I said, a payment, for example, but what they do is protect or make the person safe, the player safe within that contract, for example. Those things are unmeasurable in terms of money, but they are incredibly transformative for that player. Just to having a safe working environment, whether that's being free from harassment or and literally from a health and safety point of view, with the safety within the pit, for example. Those things are huge deals for our members too. So I think for me it's really a case of, yes, we do the big stuff, we do the stuff that that you go on the landing page, but the everyday kind of regional work, I think that is something that I'm very proud to work at the union because of that.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's brilliant to hear the sort of day-to-day victories, I think, are really important there. Yeah. Charlotte, anything from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. It is the day-to-day stuff that matters most. When you support a member to pursue a county court claim over an unpaid invoice for a gig they've done that's worth hundreds of, if not thousands of pounds, that is the union making a clear and tangible difference to the working life of a member, right? But I think it's helpful to think about the wins both in terms of the individual, that kind of thing, supporting somebody who has experienced discrimination in the workplace, supporting somebody who hasn't been paid, supporting somebody who hasn't been bullied, to get justice for what has happened here. But then there's also the bigger collective stuff. In theatre, performers and stage managers did not used to receive pay in the rehearsal period. That was entirely unpaid. Before any legislation caught up with us, we got pay for our people in that time. Pensions, before it became a statutory requirement for employers to make pension contributions to people who are workers or employees, our collective agreements required the producers to make contributions towards people's pension schemes for when they're old. you know, more recently, we've had some really huge successes with a campaign that's come out of our student deputies committee around abolishing audition fees. So drama schools all around the country will charge people, in some cases, significant sums of money just to audition. We don't believe that's reasonable. And a number of drama schools have started to agree with us and are changing their practice as a result of it. We've had a good win at Bristol recently with the City Council. They were proposing to remove the entirety of their arts and culture budget from the local authority. And thanks to campaigning by us and various other organisations within the city, they've stopped that. Bethnal Green Working Men's Club, that venue was closing. It was closing down. It was a venue of central importance to East London and beyond LGBT community, as well as being a workplace for our members. We were central to the campaign to save that venue, and now it is open and our members are performing in it once again, and it is providing good nightlife for the community in that area. The fight isn't over yet, but we've still, you know, we're still involved, we're still pursuing it. We've got a venue that was open that wouldn't have been otherwise, and our members are working in a space that was threatened with closure. So it's about, like, the wins are the stuff that we can talk about, which are the things that you'll see on the, you know, the bigger things you'll see. The success that both of our unions had at Welsh National Opera recently and elsewhere. But it's also the stuff we can't. Like, I can't give you the details of the tens of thousands of pounds that we've recently put in the pockets of some designers. I can't give you the details of the thousands upon thousands of pounds I've put in the pocket of a woman who was sexually harassed at work. But that day-to-day stuff is absolutely central to why people should be part of their trade union, because it's the individual benefits that you get and the support you get as an individual. But more important than that, it is the collective assertion that this industry can be better than it is now, and membership and activism within your trade union and involvement in the campaigns that we run for the improvement of the creative workers' working lives is how we get a better sector than we've got at the moment.
Thanks, Charlotte. That's brilliant. Thanks, Nat. That's just, yeah, it's brilliant. It's really inspiring to hear that, and to hear that the unions have got the back of their members, and that so many good things have happened. Because as we mentioned right at the start of the session, it is a precarious business. It's a difficult context, but to have that kind of support is absolutely essential and brilliant. So thank you so much. Thanks very much for being part of the session today. It's been really, really valuable. I'm gonna hand over to Hannah Yellin now, who's going to say a couple of things about things coming up with the Creative Industries Festival, and she may want to respond to things that you've said just now. So thanks so much, Charlotte and Nat. Very much appreciated your contributions.
Yeah, let me add my thanks. That was really incredible conversation, very very inspiring, and just amazing work that you do. I said in the chat, everybody join your union. They need your subs so that they can keep doing this amazing work. And also thank you, Paul, for chairing. So, and thank you everybody for coming. Please stick around. We've got our next event at 3 o'clock, and we have the producer director, Shari Petty, and the director of the Rio Cinema in Dalston, and the Hackney Council culture lead, and cultural projects commissioner and curator, and just loads of people coming together to have a conversation about carnival arts on screen, putting Caribbean Carnival on the screen. So that's from 3:30, also online, same link, keeping it simple. So do come to that. And then at 5 o'clock, I'll be interviewing the Hollywood screenwriter Eitan Marciano about his experience, Nat, with Marvel, and other kind of big blockbuster franchises and storytelling universes. So please come back at 3 and 5 o'clock, and thank you all for coming, and especially thanks to our amazing speakers.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you as well.
Thank you.